Hello, everybody. Nice to meet with you again, even virtually, in our fourth lecture and we'll be coming up in the third meeting with each other. And we'll continue laying the foundation and talking about some basic points and important features about poetry and English poetry. Let's do a quick recap here. We talked about poetry. We were in the very first and the early lectures. We were talking about defining poetry and what is poetry, and one of the definitions, it's not the only definitions but the definition, but one of the definitions we talked about is poetry is perceived as fiction. It uses specialized language. In many cases it lacks pragmatic function. It is also ambiguous, and we talked about fictional, the term fictional, specialized language, and pragmatic function and ambiguity. Then we'll move to talk about some features and characteristics of poetry, or some indicators that might indicate that this text is verse, not prose. And we were talking about some things like the layout of the poem. The layout of the text might indicate that this is verse, not prose. And we were talking about an example as this first paragraph and the following part, that the first paragraph is it takes the shape of a prose, and the second paragraph takes the shape of a poem. Then we moved to talk about the language and the specialized language, and we talked about the low space or shortness, the relative shortness of the poem, and the subjectivity. After that, we talked about the subjectivity, and talked about subjectivity as a form of self-reflection. And we talked about an important thing here later on. We talked about an immediate and direct poetry usually reflects an immediate and direct emotional status. And then we talked about the difficulty, how it is difficult to find a precise and concise definition for poetry due to the continuous changes and development on the forms and layouts of poetry. Sorry. Then we talked about some features and characteristics about for poetry: relative brevity, dense expression, musicality, which is the most important thing in poetry, the overstructuring in terms of syntax, semantics, morphology, and stylistics, deviation from everyday life, and aesthetics and self-reflection. Then started to talk about types of poetry, which we agreed that we have three main types of poetry: lyrical poetry, narrative poetry, and descriptive and active poetry. And within, while talking about the lyrical poetry, we said that lyrical poem is comparatively short, and we say comparatively, and we stressed on the fact that relatively or comparatively short is not absolute thing or fact. Lyrical poetry usually represents single speaker. Lyrical poetry, it has some the elements of the song which is consistent here. We talked about the referred to the musicality of the tune of the poem. I think it's here. Yeah, song-like, or the musicality of the poem. And we started talking about the very first and early form of lyrical poetry, and we talked about elegy. And when we talk about elegy, we're talking about death, lament, sorrow, redemption. Those are the main features and main components when we talk about elegy. We took an example. We took an example in English and in Arabic, and we differentiated between elegy and eulogy. And we mainly said that, in brief, elegy is a poem, while eulogy is prose. Elegy, it laments the death of a person in a sad tone, while eulogy, it seeks to raise or praise an important figure or person. And we talked about that some forms of traditional elegy It started usually it starts in three layers, and it has three main components or three main subjects to be covered in traditional poetry. So in traditional elegy, not in modern elegy. Such things might not be found in modern elegy. We were talking about lament, prayers, and sonets, and we talked about this example, which was written in the memorial of Abraham Lincoln death or assassination other than death. Okay, and then we talked about ode, and we differentiated between elegy and ode, and said that ode is mainly something to praise or glorify an event or an individual. And we talked about when we talked about ode, we were talking about three main components or three main layouts or structures of the ode. Again, in the traditional ode, not in the ode, modern ode, we talked about the strophe, the antistrophe, and the epode, and strophe and the antistrophe and the epode. And we took some examples about the strophe, and we talked about when we were talking about the strophe, we're talking about repetition and repetition and consistency. And in this form, we talked about repetition. It's not necessarily to be in the text and the meaning in the lines themselves, but here an example where we have repetition in the tune. And when we talked about the antistrophe, we have something of contradiction or counterbalancing in the meaning in the antistrophe, and we presented or highlighted some common of lexical indicators that might indicate that are indicating the counterbalance in the second stanza or second part of the ode here. And finally, we talked about the epode, the change of the tonal change of the rhyme and rhythm in the poem. And the last thing we talked about we talked about the sonnet here, and we talked about a iambic pentameter and rhyme scheme, okay? And then we started to talk about the three forms or three patterns of sonnets, which is patriarchal sonnet, English sonnet, and the English sonnet is divided into Spenserian sonnet and William Shakespeare's sonnets, and we talked about how to differentiate between the three forms or parts of sonnets. We had an example, and this example was somehow problematic for you, and we're going to discuss that. There's something I need to highlight here, so be patient, and we'll talk about this example here on during our discussion. I think this one is you have no problem with the second example. Then we talked about dramatic monologue. Then we started to talk about dramatic monologue or الحوار الداخلي أو النوستالجيا الداخلية, and we took an example here about dramatic monologue, and we are supposed to leave that for the discussion to discuss this point here, jealousy or narcissism or controlling over what or how can you find such a thing in this dramatic monologue or not. And finally we stopped at this point here, which is the occasional poetry. So the second type here we have in our in the types of poetry is narrative poetry, and the narrative poetry gives a verbal representation, and narrative poetry gives a verbal representation in verse. Verbal representation in verse of a sequence of connected events. It propels characters through a plot. It is always told by a narrator. And here I need to highlight something. When you talk about a sequence of events, here mainly we're talking about the first thing that comes into your mind or on our mind is a novel, okay? But during the early stages where poetry was written, in order, and at the moment, writing was not so common. Writing was so expensive. Okay, documenting things and keeping things and events in memory was not easy. Was not easily documented by writing such things down. The most important thing, or the most important tool for man to keep memories and memorize such important events was making them as a song or writing them in poetry. Writing them in poetry. So here, one of the main important things here is the narrative poetry narrates the sequence of events in phrase or in verse. Writes them in verse. Just want to highlight an important thing for you. Do you know? Assume that you know William Shakespeare, one of the most established and well-known dramatist playwrights during the Elizabethan age. His plays, or the plays of William Shakespeare, were written in verse. قصائد أو عفوا مسرحيات ويليام شكسبير كانت تكتب بالشعر وليس بالنثر. Okay, writing plays in using prose, not verse, is something new. After it came to being after the establishment and after the emergence of newspapers and after the emergence of novels. This is the most important thing here. And when we talk about poetry, okay, and the first form or the first type of narrative poetry we have now is the epic. The epic or الملحمة or epic poetry or الشعر الملحمي. When we talk about an epic, usually the first important thing that differentiate epics from lyrics is the relative length. Usually, epics are larger and longer in space or in scale, and the topic epics usually deal with are more serious than the topics and subject matters usually lyrics deal with. Usually, epics are written to commemorate or immortalize some specific events and some important events as the foundation of the nation, a glorified or great battle or war, or the beginning of the history. Besides, an important difference here between epics and lyrics is the style and the tone of and the tone an epic uses in the verses. Usually, epics use elevated or glorified style or tone, and this thing usually comes in consistency with the subject matter itself. When we're talking about elegy, it makes common sense that to say that oh poor you or أيها المسكين, okay, but it doesn't really make any sense when you want to glorify somebody or you glorify an event or a hero and you tell him or say or describe him as a poor person. Instead of saying you poor, you great, you glorified, أيها العظيم أي أيها الكبير. Okay, now, in order to give more insights about epics, okay, we have some common characteristics about epics. The first thing is the length. The first thing is the length. And here I want you to recap or go back to an important point I raised very early in this part or in this chapter when I was talking about the here we were talking about relative brevity, okay? And when I say relative brevity, I said something that is approximate, it is not absolute, which means like in some examples we had some poems that are 10 or 20, 13 or 14 lines. But when it comes to poetry, epics, for example, as the example we're going to take now, Bill, for example, which is the first English epic, it is something around 3,000 lines. Okay, so this is what I want to I meant when I was talking about the relative length, or it's not absolute to have it's not absolute always to have something about so short and limited lines in poetry. The second thing is that epics were the very first and easiest way for entertainment during the early ages. Mainly epics are, the third point is that epics are mainly derived or based on ancient traditions and events. Okay, mainly glorifying an event or glorifying something in order to commemorate or immortalize the struggles of great warriors and kings. And the last point is here the usually that I was talking here before, that the epics usually use elevated style or glorified style that is mainly characterized by greatness. And the last point is the sequence of events. Those are, generally speaking, are the main points or the main characteristics of an epic. So whenever you want to say that this poem is an epic, or this verse can be categorized within the class of epics, such features must be, or characteristics must be traced and found in the poem. Okay. We have some elements, some important elements here in an epic. As long as we were talking about that, an epic is something that tells what? It tells a story. Okay, generally speaking, or before the epic, we were talking about the narrative poetry. Is a form of storytelling, and then when we talked about the characteristics of a poem, we were talking about telling events, ancient traditions, glorifying or commemorating or immortalizing some important characters. Mainly, such things take us to the field of a storytelling, And in order to have a story, one of the most important things is in a story is the character, or the main character, or the protagonist, the hero in the character. So, in an epic, the most important element here in an epic is the legendary hero. The legendary hero. Okay, in order to have a legendary hero, in order such a hero to be legendary, a common feature was that the hero holds or possesses some supernatural things that cannot be done by ordinary men. Such supernaturalism is mainly attributed for bravery and good deeds. Okay. Such a legendary hero and the supernatural elements and features that are possessed by such a hero, and his dedication, or his dedicating the life of such a hero for bravery and good things, usually brings fame to the hero, or makes such a hero one of the most important and famous characters or towering characters during his time, or the time such an epic was written. Okay, and an example of the English poem, an example of the English epics is Beowulf. Beowulf is one of the oldest, or accordingly, or in a way or another, it is the oldest English epic. Okay, that is documented. We might have some older epics, but currently the form, or the oldest thing we have in record is the epic Beowulf. Beowulf mainly is what was written in the old English language, not even English language, old Anglo-Saxon language. Okay, this is the old script of Beowulf, and this is the new translated script. I want you just to listen to that Anglo-Saxon language here.
What way gar dana in yar dagum feud kuninga thrim ye frunan hutha athalingus ellen fremidon. Oft shield shaving shad and a threatum monegum maig thum meru setla oftea. Egg so de erlas suth an arist worth fashaft funden. Heddas frovra je bad, weox under woknum, weorth mundum tha, o that him aig wilch thara umsetindra, over hron rade, huran shulde, gomban yildan. That was god kuning. Them avra was, after Kenneth, young in yardum, thunne god sende foke de frovre. Fyr in tharve onyad, that he drugon aldor laze longe wile. Him thas lifre wodres walden, wordare foriaf. Beo was breme, blad wide sprang, schuldes avra shedilandum in. Swashal young guma, gore je weertjan, fromum feo hiftum on fader berme, that hine an ulde eft je wunien, will ye sithos, thone we kume, leod ye lasten. Lof darum shall in magtha yewera man ye theon.
So, in this video, this is part of this is the opening of the epic Beowulf. As you can see from the text and as you listen to the video, do you think this is English or the language is? Can you understand it? Even English people cannot understand it. It needs very specialized people in the old language in order to read that. But usually, when we teach the English poem, the such old poems, we use a translated version of the text. Here is on the left is the original text, part of the original text, and on the right is the translated or simplified English form of the poem. Okay. Okay. And I want you to put in your mind the characteristics of an epic, okay, and the elements of an epic, okay, and go back to the text or the translated version or the simplified version of the text and try to answer this question. Is the poem Beowulf an epic or not? If you say that this is an epic, just tell me why and justify your answer by some clues and justifications from the text itself. Okay, this point will be kept for discussion during our Zoom meeting tomorrow, inshallah. Okay, the second form or the second type of narrative poetry is mock epic or epic mock. From the naming of such a type, basically, the most equivalent or the thing that comes into my mind here when we talk about mock epic is the joke or the nukta or mainly the political joke. Usually such jokes take a serious subject and put it in a funny way, in a sarcastic way. Okay, mainly the subject is serious and the way or the form, the shape is funny, like causing laughter and sarcasm on a serious subject. But the most important thing here is for mock epic is not the fun itself, it's not laughing itself, but it is the lesson and the hidden and embedded meaning that is included in the mock epic. Usually, a mock epic usually uses the epic conventions, the style, the assumptions used, the importance of some important characters, the glorifying of some specific characters, and the heroic description of such characters. Still, what is important about the mock epic is making humor. Okay, it is like making humor. Like for example, usually in jokes and mainly political jokes, for example, usually jokes take an important event or an important figure, okay, and make him as a hero and start making laughter or making jokes or telling stories about the hero in order to make him look like as funny, okay, especially when such an event or such a character is not so popular and people do not like him. Mainly the character might not be directly pointed out in a joke, for example, but it can be easily understood. Okay, so mainly a mock epic is about making a new point in a sarcastic way. In a sarcastic way. Okay. Um, when we talk about the mock epic from the previous two slides, we can say that the most important thing is the sarcasm, oh, okay, or mocking something, okay, the use of elevated style or glorified style, okay, but it's not intended to be as the epic itself, but in order to make such a hero more as a funny person as more than making him as a hero. You might like see some heroes in some mock epics described as strong, stout with a sword, okay, but at the same time, by the progress of events in a mock epic, okay, you will discover, okay, he is strong, but he's foolish, for example, okay, he's strong, but he is immoral, okay, he has a lot of bad actions and a lot of bad deeds that contradict with the values and morals with the society. But when you look into the external part of him, also the external layout, for example, his stout body and his muscles or his sword, okay, um, and here we need to differentiate between the epic itself and the mock epic itself. Okay, as we said before, that the epic is important. Okay, it deals with an important subject. The epic tells or retells or tells the story of important events or epics or heroes in order to glorify them. But when we come to mock epic, it retells the story of such heroes, for example, or creating imagined heroes in order to exploit, to uncover, okay, to unearth some of the unpleasant features or actions of such heroes. It is more like a lesson or it is more like a lesson on raising a new point for the society or the community. For the epic, the major character and most of the most important characters in an epic come from the upper or noble class, while in the mock epic you can find them from the middle class or the lower class. It's not necessarily to be a hero from the upper or the noble class. An epic while dealing with a subject or telling the story of a nation or a story of a hero, it tells us in a really serious way. The main point is commemorating or immortalizing such an event. But when it comes to the mock epic, it treats it and it usually is not that important. It's not that important subject, trivial or silly point that is really raised in a mock epic. The epic usually intends to tell a story or tell or save the history or memorize or immortalize the specific or some specific events or heroes in the history of a nation, while the mock epics intends to exploit the fossils and manuscripts of society through the unpleasant or unwanted or unexpected events or actions and deeds of. And finally, when we come to the layout of the poem or the epic, usually it is written in a longer style. It's not necessarily to be several poems, but it is usually long and very, very long. As we took in an example of Beowulf, is something around 3,000 verses. While when it comes to mock epics, it is usually shorter than that. In English poetry, Sir Alexander Pope is one of the well-established and well-known poets who wrote mock epic. He is known to be one of the best writers ever to write a mock epic. Sir Alexander Pope, in his poem The Rap of the Lock, tells a story of stealing parts of the hair of a lady, and which is mainly was telling the story of the or the that such an event or stealing the wrap of a lock or stealing a wrap of a hair. um, in this poem started fights between English families at the sequence of the events for the poem The Rap of the Lock. And at that time, Sir Alexander Pope used this story, The Lap of the Lock, on the basis of a most important epic in history, which is the Helen of Troy or of Helen of Troy. If you want, you can refer it to. There's one well-established movie that has presented Troy. Okay, and this video, I've attached this video with the PowerPoint presentation that would give you much more details about
The Rape
the
of the
Rap of
Lock
the Lock
by
Alexander
Alexander Pope.
Pope. Okay.
Character
I will not be playing it here in order to save time, but it is with you now at the PowerPoint and you can refer to it whenever you like. The last form of narrative poetry we have here is the ballad. And we're lucky here to have something equivalent in Arabic or especially in the Palestinian folklore that is equivalent to the ballad. Originally, the ballad is transmitted orally, okay, as any other form of old poetry. It tells a story, narrative poetry. Sorry, it tells a story, but the story is not like an epic or a mock epic, but the story is from the common people. The story that is saved in the memories of people, or what we call the common history or the التاريخ الشعبي. Basically, such stories revolve around the folklore or the faults of the specific society or community. The form or the style or the layout of the ballad is written in quatrains, and each quatrain is followed by uses or follows the pentameter. Oh, sorry, the meter, where stressed syllable is followed by an unstressed syllable, and the rhyme of the poem ends like in A B A B, something like the it would be something like the Shakespearean sonnet, like the first quatrain, the Shakespearean sonnet A B A B, and it is mainly written in this way in order to ease or facilitate the memorization of the ballad. Okay. Um, Usually, the bell. Sorry, moving. Oh, okay. Just one moment. Okay. Usually, the ballad tells a story, and this story teaches something about the common traditions of a society and community. We can here refer to one of the most important and one of the most known popular or verbal history, verbal poems in Arabic in the Palestinian literature, which is the song we usually know. يا ظريف الطول ميل يا ظريف الطول ميل تقول لك رايح على الغربة وبلادك أحسن لك. I want you to keep this song in your mind and refer go to the some of the characteristics of the ballad. Some basically it tells a story, and story relatively it can be long. Um, Usually, the beginning or the opening of the ballad or the ballad poem is surprising. It uses simple language. Okay, it uses some episodes or couplets and focuses on them and later keeps repeating them. Usually, the theme or the idea or the lesson is sad or tragic. Uh, Sometimes some forms of ballads take the form of dialogue and action. Okay, it lacks some specific details. Okay, let's refer to the so for the song يا ظريف الطول. Okay, when we go to the surprising opening, from the very opening of the song يا ظريف الطول, for example, يا ظريف الطول وقفت أقول لك. Okay, stop. You know, like stopping it, like it is the song keeps undercover or doesn't tell the some specific details or some details that are mentioned or supposed to be mentioned before this event. Stop, don't move, don't go. ظريف الطول وقف تقول لك. So this, by not telling some stories or some details before this event, the event like stop, don't move, somehow surprising. And the language is used simple because usually the language or such a ballad when you come to common history and verbal history, and when basically because it is written for the common people. It's not written for well-educated people or people who can be intellectually well cultivated. It might be, or sorry, such a ballad or common history for such communities or for some communities is basically meant to be understood by everybody who in the community, who people who are educated and others who are not educated. The focus on something and on some episodes or couplets in the poem, like يا ظريف الطول وقف تقلنا. Okay, it starts with it and keeps repeating the same couplet in the song. And the tragic and the sad song can be depicted too. Like ظريف الطول is somebody who's planning to travel. Okay, and the narrator or the speaker is trying to stop here and starts to tell him about or describe him the attributes of staying, not moving, and staying in his country. Again, the form of dialogue can be seen here and the form of action. Okay, the speaker is talking to ظريف الطول. Okay, and the action is in where? Is the action of moving or traveling. يا ظريف الطول وقف تقول لك رايح على الغربة وبلادك أحسن لك. The action here can be seen in the traveling. It lacks specific details. Since our birth, we have been listening to this song, ظريف الطول, but we don't know who's ظريف الطول. This is one important detail that is missing. We don't know where is ظريف الطول traveling. It lacks some details for the reason of suspense, for example. And the continuous or the repetition of some couplets or lines in order to keep the musicality of the song, in order to facilitate the memorization of the ballad or the poem or the song. It teaches some moral lessons. Some forms of ballads do possess or start with orientation, completion, and restoration, and those parts we are going to detail and talk about in some examples later on and take them into practice. And the last point, it must take as long as it can take the form of the dialogue and can be take the form of a question and an answer. The question and an answer. The one stanza or one quatrain is a question, and the following quatrain or stanza is holds the answer. And the last thing we have here is descriptive and didactic poetry, which in a way or another we already covered some considerable parts of this descriptive and didactic poetry, which mainly describing something or attempting to teach something. For example, Sir Alexander Pope's poem about literary criticism and how to criticize poetry, or some poems that are attempting to describe or teach people how to fish. Or for example, in Arabic, we were talking about the Alfi bin Malik, that it was mainly a long poem that was basically attempting to teach people the Arabic grammar. Teach people the Arabic grammar. It mainly included all forms and examples of Arabic grammar. To this end, I think we have covered all the most of the parts and types of lyrical poetry. Looking forward to seeing you in the Zoom meeting. Thank you.